Hey Josh, thanks so much for joining the show today.
Hey, Alex. Super excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. You have a much bigger podcast than I do, so I appreciate you taking the time. Tell us a little bit
Oh,
about the book, UX Magazine, and the podcast and what you're working on.
sure. I can take you on a bit of a journey there, if that's okay. So I came to UX, I think, through weirdly a love of magazines, I think. Like as a kid, I would spend a lot of time sitting in front of newsstands at grocery stores by my house. But when I think about websites, I mean, they sort of mirror magazines in a lot of ways. And so through working at through various magazines, I came to UX Magazine, and I was brought on there for my ability to edit articles more than my knowledge of UX. So that was an interesting transition, but I just spent a few years there, like learning as much as I could from all these brilliant practitioners working around the globe. It was like a really cool, unique opportunity. And you brought up podcasting. I think it might have been back in like 2012 or something. We put together a podcast, the UX Magazine, called In Conversation with UX Magazine. Podcasts weren't really as big of a thing, so it's kind of hard to know where to post it. But we had some early experiences there. And then I actually got kind of a chance to put a lot of my knowledge into practice in the service industry. My wife is a really busy hairstylist, and for a few years, we owned a hair salon together. And I was sort of in charge of doing all sorts of stuff that I quickly realized was very experience design adjacent, like creating websites, signage, videos, and then thinking about like customer flows and sort of workflows inside of the salon. It was really kind of fascinating to kind of put that knowledge into practice in sort of an unorthodox environment, at least in terms of a lot of the things I'd been reading about and helping articles I'd been helping to edit and things I'd been writing. So, and then I got the opportunity to work with Rob Wilson, who is a CEO and co-founder of OneReach.ai. And, he's been working with AI for decades, really.
Yeah.
We worked for several years on a book called Age of Invisible Machines that we were delighted and surprised when it became a best-selling book. And then, a couple months after it was released, ChatGPT arrived and sort of confirmed some of the things that Rob had been seeing for years, that there would be some sort of mass adoption moment. So that was kind of crazy to see that come true so quickly. But then, we'd sort of assumed that organizations would be the ones to really grab onto AI and see what could be done with it, right? And we sort of created a guidebook for how they could do that. But obviously what we've seen is organizations are kind of dragging their feet a little bit, and it's individuals who have really latched onto these tools and pushed their limits and found ways to use them in new and exciting ways. And now I think we're to a point where that's starting to affect organizations, right? You have, whether the use is sanctioned or not, you have all sorts of employees using these tools to build themselves agents, to upskill essentially. And then you kind of hit a wall, right? Like even if you're sort of overseeing a lot of that stuff within an organization and people are showing you all this cool stuff that they're building, if you want to try and orchestrate those agents together, share them across departments or verticals, you're kind of in a bind. And so the thing that Rob's been working on, I mean, for 20 years, it's kind of evolved a lot, but it's what it is what he calls an agent runtime. And that's sort of an environment where you can govern and orchestrate AI agents, and importantly, connect them to canonical knowledge, or sort of like a source of truth. So a lot of the work that I've been doing recently is kind of adjacent to knowledge management, which is funny because it's sort of like the boring part of AI. It's something that no one is like super excited to jump into. But as someone who's been a writer for 30 years, I'm realizing that it actually is a design challenge that I am somewhat suited to. And so that's interesting because I think designers feel this, or feel like kind of a similar thing. I would assume, these tools are very powerful, but they're also kind of creepy to me, right? Like I'm a specialist, and these things can do a lot of what I do very well. And so that's kind of threatening and strange, but I also kind of have to remind myself that on the other side of that, there's a lot of people who have really good ideas, but aren't necessarily comfortable sharing with the world because they aren't writers or aren't trained communicators or whatever. And so it does provide opportunities for better idea sharing, which is cool too. So yeah, but like when I'm writing magazine articles or fiction or creative nonfiction, I have no desire to use LLMs to help me write words. I think because these are like really personal endeavors, and I like to think maybe I'm right that they help me grow my brain, or maybe I'm just fooling myself there. But
Yeah, I think you touched on a ton of interesting things. I mean, there's a lot of new research coming out saying, if you're using these tools to do all your writing or all your designing,
Hmm.
you're actually like atrophying your ability to write. So, and I think
Yeah.
the other thing that was interesting there is like, I think you're right. Like, it's weird if you talk to someone from Gen Alpha, like they're using ChatGPT for everything. And it's
Hmm.
kind of scary. It's like, wait, you need to critically think about this a little bit before you just have a
Yeah.
machine answer it for you. But on the org side, you're totally right. I see a lot of
Hmm.
the same problems you alluded to earlier, which is these orgs do not have this figured out. It feels like the risk of hallucinations in your software, showing an end user a wrong number or something in a critical dashboard is a huge risk, or a security risk, or other data leaking into the model. So like how are you seeing orgs evolve?
Organizations can feel like they're doing a lot of work by like going through backlogs of old design projects that they never had time or resources for. But that doesn't really move the needle much in terms of the kind of infrastructure and system redesign that most organizations need, right? They're still designing old software. So again, like the boring part is what's really important. This knowledge management piece. We had the opportunity, it was a couple of years ago, I think, to talk with Jeff McMillan, who leads a lot of AI endeavors at Morgan Stanley. And he, at the time, I think this was pre-ChatGPT, was working closely with OpenAI, and Sam Altman, I think, was even involved in the project. And they were basically wanted to create agents that could help their advisors in real time, like while they're talking to clients, like they could ask questions and get reliable answers. And so they were using some of OpenAI's tools to achieve that. And what they realized was that it was much, much more complicated, obviously, than just dumping all their documents into a repository. They realized that what they really needed to do was assign people to information, give information a time to live so that it's like getting reevaluated, and it was just a heavy lift. But I think we actually were talking about it yesterday. We want to try and talk to him again. They've been on the podcast a couple of times, but I'd be curious to see if that's now given them an advantage now that they have some source of truth knowledge. Obviously, it wouldn't probably spread to their entire organization, but there's a lot of information that they now have that can be reliably accessed by LLMs, which really are more of like an interface into a system for organizing information, at least if you're really pursuing agentic AI and multi-agent orchestration.
Let's talk about the design side. You're at UX Magazine. I see a ton of different takes. I find it a bit, there's a lot of like fundamental rules in UX, and I hear a lot of like, oh, the interface is going to die. You're just going to talk to a machine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little bit hesitant to believe that that's imminent. I think people are visual, and if you follow Jacob's law, like we want things to look similar and feel similar, and it's not necessarily the most efficient way to interact with a computer, right? Like Alexa and Siri have been around for decades now, and their adoption's not that high. So I mean, like I think on the design side too, another question I have is you mentioned it, right? Like coding is a language. It's a confined language like writing. These are large
Mm-hmm.
language models. I feel like for writing and coding, they're there, right? Like it's pretty good, right? Like that junior dev is it may no longer make sense to go study dev in school, right? But for
Mm-hmm.
design, a lot of the output I see from a Lovable, a Replit, even Figma make, it just really looks the same and it breaks
Mm-hmm.
down when you try and scale it. So I guess my question is, where do you see this heading with design? Is it truly like interfaces are dead and design's dead, or has it not had that same speed of adoption for writing or coding?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think interfaces are necessarily dead or anything like that. I think they'll
Mhm.
probably change. If you think about something like a hamburger menu or something like that, you don't necessarily need your organization or excuse me, you don't really necessarily need your information stack like that anymore. If you have a reliable agent that actually knows what a system can do for a given user, you can just come right in and present it with your problem and it can tell you what it can do. And that would be the ideal, right? And then you're reducing some of that cognitive load of like looking through a list, seeing if it can do what you need it to do. But obviously, that's again one of those areas where if you ask an attached LLM, it can do anything, right? And it knows anything, and it'll hallucinate at will. But if it has a source of truth knowledge that it's working from, and it's connected to the other software within your organization, then I think the need for the older kinds of visual design or interface design might start to fade. Like dashboards are still incredibly useful, obviously. Like if you're monitoring a whole bunch of agents doing work, you need to be able to somehow see what they're doing, if they're failing, what parts of the organization are using them. There's all sorts of things that visual design can, information that it can give you a lot faster than it would come to you conversationally. And that I don't think will change. But I do think, software can now kind of be written ephemerally, right? We're really close to a moment where if you're in a rich web chat and you're asking, let's say it's like an organizational agent and you're asking it questions about sales or something, it could just whip up a quick visual for you based on solely your question. And maybe that visual, that pie chart or that graph becomes part of institutional knowledge that other people would use, or maybe it's just something you needed in the moment and then it disappears. And so we do think a lot about, I think we're still calling them micro UIs. If you imagine you're interacting through a rich web chat, there's all sorts of moments that might come up. Like if you're going to make a purchase, it would probably be better to have like a little micro UI, a little app showing you a trusted vendor for that purchase, or like a credit card company, so you don't feel like you're just telling a conversational tool to make a purchase. It says it does, and you just take its word for it. Like, I think we still like to have those visual reminders. So there's all sorts of different instances where you do want to communicate things visual. And I don't think that will change. But I think increasingly those visualizations might just be generated on the fly. And so I wonder, like, designers will still be involved, but I don't know that they'll be involved with like every instance, right? They might be the ones creating all sorts of guidelines and rules for an LLM, or it would be a multi-agent system to follow as it's generating those kinds of visuals. So it's strange because, like I mentioned earlier, being sort of a specialist as a writer, one thing I hear a lot from people is that specialists are dead, right? You don't need specialists anymore because AIs can kind of take over some of that. And I think that might be true. Like, a design project that I've been working on is building a knowledge model. We have models that are trained specifically on both editions of our book. And then I've been building a model that's trained on information from our podcast, right? Like just taking summaries or transcriptions of our podcast and creating summaries that I verify and add to, and then putting those into this modeling tool that like visually creates different tags and notes that I then go through and verify. And it's like a writing process, but it's also like a design process. And I'm also thinking about information and the way that it connects, which is really a design problem. Like, even if I'm writing fiction, I feel like I'm designing something. I'm designing an experience that I want a reader to have. And so building these source of truth kind of models does feel like a design process. And it also, to a degree, like, I guess once the work is done, like, I'm no longer needed if the thing's fully trained. But with the podcast, we're adding to it all the time. So there's that. But what's exciting about this this new kind of work is, like, we have this source of truth knowledge, right? But I open it up and it's just like any other LLM where I'm staring at it and be like, what do I want to ask it about the book?
Yeah.
And if I can't think of anything, I just go on to do something else. And so we're designing sort of an LMS tool right now where you open it up and it starts asking you questions. And so it's
I love that.
trying to figure out who you are, learning about your interest in AI, if you've used it already, what you know about it. And then it maps you to one of many personas, to like the type of learner you might be. And then using all this material from both editions of the book and ongoing podcast episodes, it creates a learning program for you, one that's designed to like keep you engaged, but also help you in your current role because it kind of knows what your objectives are. And so it starts there, the idea being that, if I'm designing an experience for someone and I'm thinking of myself even, I'm like, the areas that I'm most interested in, if that's where they start, I think I'm going to be more engaged. And then it is almost circular, where the goal is to kind of fill in all their gaps. So at the end of it, they kind of know everything that they would know if they had read the book really closely. But I think it'll be an interesting experience. Will it be more effective than reading the book? Probably yes for some people and no for others. But I think these are some of the sort of design challenges that are emerging, right? It's like I designing this tool was very fluid and nebulous, and I really wasn't even thinking at all about what it would look like for many weeks. And then finally arrived at a point where I'm like, okay, I guess now we'll kind of think about what it would look like, because it was really more about how would it behave? What kind of questions would it ask? Like, how is it going to map this information? So it just sort of changes the nature of design, but all those tools that are in a practitioner's tool bag are still very, very useful. And I do think, in my own experience, even, like, I've been hesitant to use AI as a writer. Like, that makes me uncomfortable. Like, I don't like it to write for me. I don't want it to do that, because that's kind of how I process my thinking. But I have found that there are all these other applications that are quite kind of exciting to me, and that where I feel like it is very useful. Part of the thing with books too is, like, there are certain people that really love books. I love when someone hands me a book, but you were talking about Gen Alpha, and And there's just a lot of people that don't necessarily get their information from books. And so if we really want that information out there and want to make sure that we're helping as many people as we can learn about this stuff, it makes sense to try and design some experiences that could reach more people and be more impactful and help them kind of figure out how they'll become, I guess, a generalist in this new weird world.
Yeah, I think one of the things you touched on there, which is interesting to me, is almost like the UX of AI. And you're saying that I guess the bot or the model you're building almost prompts the user to find out what they're interested in. And I think that's so needed because an open-ended chat box, yeah, there's 20% of power users out there know what to do with that. Hey, the world's at your fingertips, but that doesn't scale to the general public. And the UX of AI is something that I'm always talking about. This needs to become more intuitive or more relevant for the general public to what do I do here, or how is this going to help me? So I like that you're thinking about that. My final question, Josh, is, I hear from a lot of designers, oh, this changes every week. I don't know what tool to use. They're overwhelmed right now by AI. It comes out and it's like, no, don't use Cursor anymore. Use Cloud Code, or don't use Lovable. Use Figma Make. What advice do you have for designers or devs right now that are maybe feeling overwhelmed or don't know how to navigate the landscape of AI?
Yeah, that's a good question. I am not like a heavy user of design tools per se, but I do think it's good to just experiment with as many free tools as you can. And like I've been playing around with Cursor, and one thing I like about it is that you can obviously select from different models. So, and I think you can gain a lot of insight by that, by if you use one model to conjure something, or if you have some information. Like we've been working on some course materials, some teaching tools. And so I want to test, like, is this course outline going to be really desirable for this target audience? And then I can ask every model and see what they say and kind of balance those responses. And I think the same is true of like designing things. It's a little different because I think because like you mentioned, like the designs tend to look a little more cookie cutter as they come out. But if you're using these tools to try and refine those, or even if you're starting from scratch, you always have the opportunity to kind of throw it in another tool, see what it thinks of your design, or see how it would change it, and kind of use that to shape whatever your sort of, I guess it wouldn't be, there's never a final product anymore, right? But whatever you're going to show to other people, I suppose, you can use tools in those ways to kind of hone your designs. But it's a weird area too, obviously, because so much of the knowledge that these models were trained on is stolen in some sense. It was just scraped and taken before anyone even knew to watch for that sort of thing. So that's another thing. It's like an uneasy thing. There's especially as an artist, right? There's the idea that it's infringing on your creative output, and then also that it's stolen a lot of creative output. But we're obviously in a moment where we're not going to put any toothpaste back into the proverbial tube. So I think the best option is to try and figure out how you can make these tools work for you, since you can use a lot of them without having to spend your own money. You're obviously giving them your attention, which is what they want and what they're using. So you need to think about that too. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to upskill and kind of push yourself forward and find a place in this very shifty new world.
Yeah, just keep experimenting. I totally agree. Josh, thanks so much for sharing and chatting with me today. This is definitely insightful. Where can folks go to find the book? And I don't know if the model you mentioned is public. Where can they find that and interact with that if they don't have the attention span for the book, as we talked about?
Yeah. So the book is available everywhere. You can buy it from Wiley. I think it's better for us somehow if you buy it through Amazon. So I guess you can do that as well. The podcast is called Invisible Machines, and that's a podcast that Rob and I do, and we release episodes roughly every 2 weeks. That's available wherever you get your podcasts. I mentioned OneReach.ai. That's the company that Rob co-founded and is CEO of. And there are all sorts of exciting demos and things available on our website there. And the knowledge modeling tool is not publicly available at present, but we did record an episode recently with Joe Dos Santos, who is, I think, a VP of AI at Workday. Apologies, Joe, for not knowing your title offhand, but we do show him pieces of the knowledge model. You can see the knowledge model that we use for the podcast in that episode, and it's kind of cool. It's sort of a new approach to modeling knowledge, and it's one that we're pretty excited about. So yeah, thanks, Alex, for letting me share all this information with you and your audience. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on.